Hello, welcome to InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw. In the wake of the Union Gospel Mission stabbing June 1st, which injured 12 people, several critically, City Mayor Julie Hoy called for greater downtown police presence. In this case, police responded immediately to the men's shelter and quickly apprehended the suspect. All victims were told, even those hospitalized with grave injuries, are expected to recover. At the City Council's crowded, nearly 5-hour June 9th meeting, Mayor Hoy urged the community to work together to build a safer Salem, including identifying public safety hotspots in a coordinating way. But what does this mean? What will the new downtown safety program look like going forward? My guest today is Jimmy Jones, Executive Director of the Mid-Willamette Valley Community Action Agency. In public testimony that night, he backed efforts to make downtown safer and create even a mobile crisis team, but he questions some of the assumptions behind the move. Would you please welcome him? Hello, nice to see you here, Jimmy. I want to make sure that people know what you said. You said the homeless are frequently the victims of crime, not the architects of it. What are the assumptions we're talking about? I ask to know.
Thank you, Wendy. It's great to be on the show, and really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk about our work and this really serious set of issues that are facing Oregon and Salem here in 2025. And I think the assumptions that I am referring to in that statement have to do with a lot of the baseline beliefs that people have when they consider the homeless condition, and quite frankly, some irrational fears that they may have about poverty and about folks who are suffering from pretty extreme poverty at times. And what we have seen in recent years, going back to 2019, when the city enacted its very ill-conceived camping ban.
Why do you call it that?
What we saw back then was the same desire that we see now. There was a heavy presence of homeless folks in the downtown, much greater, I might add, then than now. We had people camping on the street. There was a lot of extreme poverty needs. There were certainly drug conditions that people had because of this historic underperformance and inadequacy of the state hospital system in Oregon and around the country. There are quite a few people out there on the street who really ought to be in some form of assisted living facility, managed care facility, and some kind of institutional care. So back in 2019, in the winter, 2018-2019, we saw a lot of these conditions manifesting themselves. And at the same time, the business community was beginning to suffer from changes in the economy with regard to online retailing, and a lot of the traditional economic structures of shopping were changing in a lot of ways. So the city began to believe, the city council believed, that the best way to solve this problem was to enact a tent camping ban in the city, toyed around with a sit-lie ordinance, which would have prevented people from lying down on the sidewalk or sitting in one place too long. And we warned them, you can go back and look at the public record then, that there would be unintended downstream consequences of that action. So when they took away people's ability to put up a tent and to get out of the weather, all they did was to crowd under the overhangs across the downtown core. So there were a couple of hundred people living outside of Nordstrom and along the back wall of Rite Aid, all compressed together in very unsafe and unsanitary conditions. We had a baby born on the sidewalk back then. It was really just horrific stuff. And all of it was unnecessary. So when the pandemic began in early 2020, I worked with Mayor Bennett, City Manager Powers, City Council, and others to help find a way to suspend the city's tent camping ban so that people could disperse, so we wouldn't have a large concentration of people who are not vaccinated and stood at the time, now we didn't know as much about the virus then as we would later on, of being really vulnerable to a respiratory virus in those conditions. So the city allowed the homeless population to disperse. In the meantime, massive resources poured into the region. We added 1,000 shelter beds across the city of Salem, and as a result of that, We have far fewer people outside in town today than we did back then. It was just a failure of public policy.
When you think about the consequences for the people who are moved and perhaps incarcerated, they could make bail perhaps, but no one has the money to do that, so they end up just staying there.
They end up staying there, or sometimes they're just released on their own recognizance. And we see this sort of, street to jail to court, back to street pipeline that just gets repeated hundreds and hundreds of times. There was no way that the city was going to be able to arrest its way out of this problem. No municipality in the country had been able to do that. And I think even going back 7 or 8 years ago, the local leadership here in town, also at the county, began to realize that that was not going to be a successful solution. So this current environment that we're in, people are generally confused and sort of fumbling for a way forward because there are certain legal limitations now that exist that did not exist back then about the way and means and mode in which camps can be trespassed. And I just want to be clear for the record that there are times when homeless camps have to be dispersed. There are moments when public safety and public health really force government into action. But that should be considered with great reservation and slow and due examination and diligence of process. Because mostly what happens when government is too eager to trespass camping situations is that we have and create more trauma for the campers themselves, for the people who are outside. In many cases, we're talking about folks who have mobility limitations, they have chronic health conditions, they are disabled. So there can be pretty disastrous health consequences for folks on top of the other psychological trauma that they're suffering from, having the government come in, knock on their tent and say, I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here. So I think that the city, the county, the state have to be very careful about when and where they do that if they're concerned about the outcomes on the homeless population.
You also work at the state level with community action agencies. Are they saying and seeing the same thing that you're seeing here in Salem, where they want some core part of their cities to be able to move people out so that they don't have to have them present, because they want to think of the city itself as vibrant and safe and attractive?
The same things that are happening here are happening all across Oregon, and quite frankly, Salem has been fairly progressive on this issue for the last 4 years or so, and it's only more recently that these conversations around exclusion have begun to resurface again. But what you see across the state, I think the winds are changing in a lot of ways. The winds at the federal level and the local level. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we had state law that regulated the time, the place, and the manner by which homeless camps could be trespassed. And that state law was a reflection of the current case law at the Ninth Circuit of the federal courts. That case law goes back to 2018, Martin versus Boise, 2020, 2021, the Grants Pass versus Johnson in Southern Oregon. That case, Grants Pass, last summer went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and what the U.S. Supreme Court ruled was that the protections that the Ninth Circuit had created were not correct constitutionally, so that the homeless populations did not have an Eighth Amendment protection from being arrested or fined or cited for camping outside. And in Oregon, we have this really odd circumstance and situation where we have the state law that actually protects the homeless population to a certain degree around those things. So there's been enormous pressure. There were several bills filed in the legislature over the course of this session to try to repeal those statewide protections. Now, we held the line on that to keep those protections in place, but there are still efforts all across the state to push the homeless population out of the downtown cores, outside of cities. And the gravest possible outcome of this are more incidents like what happened at UGM. Because if we are going to drive the homeless population from one location to the other, one jurisdiction to the other, one town to the other, all you're doing is placing people who aren't really familiar with the local services, local law enforcement, local community, into incredibly high stressful and traumatic situations. So the propensity of violence in those situations increases. So there are, again, ill-conceived aspects to this public policy of exclusion that's beginning to emerge.
I know this may sound strange, but I'm hearing from you something more like they're blaming the people who are the victims of poverty and blaming them for bringing it on themselves or something. There's a history to that.
It's a very convenient excuse. Around 5 or 6 years ago, there was this famous video in Seattle called "Seattle is Dying." And essentially the theme of that documentary was essentially that the homeless were killing Seattle because they were making it impossible to conduct business in the downtown. There was drugs and mental health and all sorts of things that were just really depressing the vibrancy of Seattle. The truth, however, is that Seattle is one of the richest, most economically vibrant cities in America, and it is doing very, very well. If there was any truth to that analogy, it was that Seattle is killing the homeless. We are very uncomfortable watching other people's poverty. Most people had rather not see the sufferings of others. The public just wants this issue to go away. They are uncomfortable seeing it, and they want it out of sight and out of mind. And there are ways to accomplish that without harming people, especially providing housing, providing sheltering. But this issue, as you mentioned, has a long history in this country.
How far back does this go? This get rid of the problem, but don't necessarily look at it and blame the people who are the victims of it for their own problems.
It's a tragedy about 130 years in the making from a bunch of poor public policy choices made by governments across the country at the local, state, and federal level. Some of it is simply a manifestation of the religious history of this country, and especially with regard to the moral implications for why the general public believes that people are in poverty. There's always been this assumption that if people aren't succeeding in life, it is because there's something inherently wrong with them, that they lack conviction, they lack initiative, that they lack the moral fiber to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, to accept accountability, and to take charge of their own destiny. And that's a much older theme. It goes way back to the beginning of the Republic. But what we see in terms of the modern manifestation of this really dates to the Industrial Revolution. And once people began to move off of farms and into cities, and off of farms into factories, once the concentration of wealth became what it was in the late 19th century, there was a segment of society who, for whatever reason, could not make it in that kind of market-based competitive capitalist system that was becoming the dominant force in the country. So, as we saw in the late 1890s, there was a lot of urban poverty. You go to places like Detroit and New York and Philadelphia, a lot of homelessness in those cities back then. And cities and counties across the country in that era were struggling to find ways to solve this problem. So the first answer, going back to around the 1890s, was the creation of poor farms. So if any of the viewers at home have been to Edgefield McMenamins out there in Troutdale, that was the Multnomah County Poor Farm at the turn of the century, the last century. And essentially the poor farms were places where folks who, for whatever reason, could not compete or could not provide for themselves in modern society were sent to live out their lives. They were given room and board, a few chores, and they were excluded in many ways from the vibrancy of modern society. And what we saw there is that was a dominant model from around 1890 to about 1920. Those models, those systems, worked more or less well or not so well across the country depending on local conditions. They were almost entirely financed by county governments at the local level. And that worked up until around 1929 when the Depression happened and county governments were broke and they could no longer fund those poor farm models. But never fear, there was another answer. So at about the same time, because of the rise of modern medicine, the professionalization of the medical profession, we had the creation of larger and expanding state hospital systems across the country. Increasingly, these were funded by state legislatures or later on a little bit by the federal government. And those were places where folks were sent, excluded from society, who couldn't take care of themselves. And it wasn't just the deeply mentally ill that were in those institutions. It were also anybody who was elderly, who had no source of support. It was people who were generally poor. It were folks who had drug addictions and things of that nature. Anybody who couldn't fit into this increasingly narrowing definition of normalcy were sent into those kinds of institutions. So that grew and grew and grew up until the 1950s. By 1955, we had about 475 people per 100,000 in institutions of care across the country. But at the very moment those state hospital systems were created, they kind of sowed the seeds of their own destruction, because one of the dominant social medical movements of the 1920s was the eugenics movement. And that was simply the belief that the folks who were ending up in these kinds of institutions, we not only needed to make sure that they were excluded from society, but that they were not in any capacity or ability to reproduce. So we had sterilization campaigns in the 1920s, and those practices continued all the way down here in Oregon until the early 1980s. That was the last forced sterilization in Oregon, was in the early 1980s. But the American experience with World War II began to cause the general public to have a lot of caution and concern around those practices. So going off and fighting the Nazis and fighting against an evil regime that had created extermination camps and essentially decided that certain segments of the population were subhuman and weren't worthy of dignity and justice and even life. Not just the Jewish population, but other folks that they labeled as undesirables, everyone from the gypsies to folks who were disabled. Millions of people lost their lives. So when we defeated that fascist ideology and came home, a lot of people began to look at American systems and look for things that echoed some of those earlier very disturbing developments. We also have some phenomenal developments in modern medicine taking place in the 50s and 60s with really wonderful new drugs that many of these conditions that people were locked away from the rest of us could be successfully treated. And so the movement was increasingly by the late 50s that the state hospital system was a mistake. Most people could be successfully treated for any mental health condition they had in their local community, at community mental health models, at county mental health departments, where they could get their medications, and we could reintegrate most people back into society. Now, the belief there was born out of a lot of compassion and empathy and expressions of human dignity, but at the same time there were mistakes that were made. So we went from around 475 people per 100,000 in 1955. By the time we get to the 80s, we were down to about 18 people per 100,000. So basically they opened up all of those facilities where people had been locked away in, and that might have worked better if those community mental health systems had been funded. But at the same time, the federal hospital systems were taken out, the state mental health institutions were taken out, we also saw the just massive funding cuts for this community mental health model. So the trigger point around all of this was in 1963. In 1963, Congress passed the Community Mental Health Act, which basically began this transition away from this state hospital system that had dominated the landscape from the 1920s all the way down to the 1950s and toward this community mental health model. But in the same breath, it did not provide the funding that was necessary for these folks to have successful treatment outcomes in the community. And then we mixed that into an era in the 1980s when we had massive destructive funding cuts of the social safety net. The HUD budget was decimated in those generations. One of the most successful direct cash payment programs came under assault. That was Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, the checks people used to get. It would refer to as welfare checks back then. That program was ended in the late 90s. So we get to the point by 2000, that 1999, 2001, right up just before 9/11, the social safety net that we had spent generations constructing was mostly decimated.
And as part of that, a solution that President Johnson came up with was, well, war on poverty, and that was enacted, and out of that grew things like Medicaid, Medicare, some of the things that exist today, which are now under fire as well.
They very much are under fire, and it's quite ironic in some ways because our agency, the Mid-Willamette Valley Community Action Agency, was born out of that same era, born out of the civil rights movement, born out of the pursuit of economic justice. So in 1963, we also had the Economic Opportunity Act, 1964, Economic Opportunity Act, which created the community action model, created the war on poverty, created Project Head Start, and paved the way for energy assistance and all of those social safety net programs that became so critical. And as we move toward the present, certainly in this current administration, we have a lot of those programs that are very clearly being targeted for reductions or elimination, which would further erode an already shaky social safety net. I would add too, I think one of the other dimensions in this is the drug crisis. So if you grew up in a rural environment in America in the 1970s, probably mostly the only drug you ever saw was marijuana. Maybe if you were in town, a little bit of acid, and if you were rich, you might have access to cocaine. The nature of the drug problem changed dramatically in the 1980s. We had the emergence of crack cocaine, methamphetamine, which was the drug that kind of just really devastated the country in the 1990s. Heroin, which is in the broadest possible sense of what I'm going to describe here, our biggest problem today, was mostly a dead drug by about 1999. The rates of use were way down. But after 9/11, we sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers off to fight in these foreign wars. There was a lot of health consequences from that, and there was a massive overprescription of opioids, synthetic opioids, in the era around 2002 to 2007, and it created a dependency on opioids that once the federal government and the medical industry began to crack down on, that fueled the rise of these synthetic drugs that we see, illegal drugs that we see today, including all the way down to fentanyl. So again, another government manufactured crisis from poor public policy choices. But getting back to your point, currently in the president's budget that's being considered by Congress right now, the HUD programs at the federal level would be cut by 44%, including a 43% cut in the homeless services program. So all of us, I think, are very worried that a lot of the progress we've made at the state and federal level over the last 5 years in particular might be lost. So we have 1,000 people in shelter tonight. My agency has about 300. There are 700 more across the community. What would happen to Salem if, for whatever reason, the funding for those resources went away? You would see a massive increase in the homeless population in Salem. And that doesn't even include the economic forces that are driving new people into homelessness. So this is a very serious issue, and we have to make the right choices.
Give us some hope here. What do you recommend that be done? Do you have ideas that would, based on your experience and the counsel of those who think, yeah, this could work, what ideas do you have?
The good thing is that it's a pretty easy problem to solve. But to solve any problem, you have to have the resources, the means, and the opportunity to do so. And solving the homeless problem rests on 4 key practices. 4 practices. The first practice is we need to prevent people who are endangered of losing their homes right now from losing their homes. We need to keep them in their homes. So funding prevention work, which is rental assistance for folks who are facing eviction, is absolutely vital. We did not do very well in the current legislative session on prevention. We did very well in other areas. So if we had received the full funding that was on the table, we could have prevented another 20,000 households from losing their homes over the next 2 years. Now, not all those people will become homeless, but enough of them will to grow the population. So we have to prevent new people from entering into the system. That's number one. Number two is we have to shelter the people who are outside. The public's greatest frustration, I think, is around seeing people on the street, seeing people sleeping in doorways of businesses, seeing people who are visibly suffering outside, and they want something done about it. It is, without a doubt, the single greatest concern in the state today if you poll the public. And the easiest way to make a significant reduction in that physical manifestation of homelessness is just to adequately provide shelter. Now, that is not something the state had ever done much of prior to about 2020. Most sheltering, Wendy, was private charity models, and it was by its nature a very high barrier. Yes, you can come into my shelter, but you can't bring your partner. Yes, you can come into my shelter, but you can't bring your pet. Nobody's going to leave their dog outside to take a room. Yes, you can come into my shelter, Wendy, but I'm going to make you blow into this device when you come in to make sure that you're sober. And every time that you present here, I'm going to make sure that you're sober. So those are high barrier policies that prevent people from accessing shelter. So we need to prevent people from becoming homeless. We need to shelter those folks who are outside. And then the ones who are outside or are in shelter, we need to rehouse them through various models. Everything from here's a check to get you back into the apartment, to get you to deposit. You still have a job, so we'll be able to take care of you pretty quickly, to a 2-year placement where we can provide you with case management, resources, connection to treatment, connection to SNAP benefits and jobs and those sorts of things. Those people can mostly become self-sufficient again. Or we could put you into a system called permanent supportive housing, long-term assistance, long-term case management for people who have serious disabilities and may not ever work again and just can't financially support themselves. So prevent, shelter, rehouse, and then the fourth and final component is we have to become serious about building enough units in this state that are affordable. We probably are going to be somewhere close to 50,000 units short in the next 20, 25 years. 50,000 units extra that have to be built just to absorb the population's housing needs ahead of us. What we see is that about 2/3 of those 50,000 units really need to be affordable. That is, somebody who's making 60% of area median income can support. So we need to prevent, we need to shelter, we need to rehouse, and we need to make sure there are enough units out there so that we can put people inside and they can afford to stay in them once they're in them. Right now, for the poorest population in the state, and we usually refer to a demographic there of 0 to 30% of area median income. These are folks usually making $20,000, $25,000 or less, usually singles, in some cases not on any public assistance at all. That population, there are 4.2 households for every one available unit in Oregon. 4.2 for every one available unit. So we're not doing a good enough job, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. Everything from really an outdated land use system to the state not incentivizing investment enough successfully. There's just a whole host of solutions to helping solve that problem that are equally complicated. But prevent, shelter, rehouse, and build. And between them, this is a solvable problem. And our goal should be really to just reduce the total that we have outside right now. Any number that's reducing itself over time eventually reaches 0. And that's the other message for the public. As I've been trying to construct here, this did not happen overnight. It did not happen last year. It did not happen 10 years ago. It has been decades in the making, and it's not going to be solved no matter what anyone tells you, any political figure tells you. It's not going to be solved overnight. It's going to take years of diligence, investment, and consistent application of practice, but we can get there.
Thank you so much for telling us what I'm sure many of us didn't know and need to know going forward to be part of the solution.
It's a very convenient narrative to blame people for their own suffering because it allows us to avoid looking in the mirror. It allows us to avoid the consequences of a sort of self-examination that leads us to the point that we realize that we have some responsibility to fix this. it forces us on self-examination to realize that these are our brothers and sisters, these are our neighbors, and our society, our community is only as strong as the way we treat the weakest members of it. And if we can't get to the point where we see them as equal members of our community, people who are deserving of love and compassion and dignity, I fear more for the rest of us than I do for the homeless population. And most of these people are out there by accident. In my experience with dealing with thousands of people, there are a few folks who have just made what I regard as terrible choices that led them into this, or a few people who just take the hook off of life and say, I can't do it, I'm going to go outside. But that is such a tiny minority. I'm talking about less than 3% of that group. Mostly what we have are people who went to jail and got out and can't get a job and can't find a place to live. We have people who fled from domestic violence for the safety of themselves and others and ended up in a camp and then got stuck there. We have people who got injured on a job. One of my fellows that I worked for years to try to help, he was working a job in a lumber mill and had a 2x4 fall from the second floor and hit him square in the forehead with the hard end, and he had a traumatic brain injury from that, and he never recovered. We've had car wrecks, and a lot of it is just bad luck.
And in a country where in many ways people judge you on how successful you are and the education you have, and a lot of parameters that make it difficult to get out of where you are.
Our agency's vision is, I think, one of the most beautiful things we've ever written. Our mission is, we're here to provide services and community leadership and help people exit poverty. So that's a pretty standard mission for a nonprofit community action agency. But our mission is that we believe that each and every person has infinite worth to us all, and that the greatest tragedy in life is when people aren't allowed to reach their full potential. And it's not only a tragedy for the person, it's a tragedy for everybody else. And if we can't see to a future in which we look at people not for their deficiencies but for their potential, I'm 57 years old this year, and I'm deeply disturbed by the direction of the country in a lot of ways. Not just politics. I think sometimes that's a sideshow. But we've reached this point where we all feel lonely and isolated. When I grew up in the South, my grandmother lived 50 yards away and my uncle was 50 yards on the other side, and then there was nobody for 5 miles around. But if something happened and I was in trouble, I knew exactly where to go to get help. But I couldn't tell you the names of most of the neighbors on my street right now, right? There's some sense of community that has been lost, I think. And I think we're all struggling to try to find our way back to a place of belonging. And the homeless issue, I think, in a lot of ways, is a canary in the coal mine for our entire civilization. It's evidence that our economy is not working. It's evidence that the political economy of capitalism, this broader system that we all are participating in, is leaving some people behind that can't escape it. It's evidence that, when I look at the way people talk about and describe and attribute things to the homeless population, I'm less moved by what they have to say about the homeless and more sad for the people who are saying those things, because it tells me that love is absent from their heart, empathy is absent from their heart, and they are really struggling to find a way to themselves have joy in life. Elevating yourself by hurting others is one of the worst attributes that any of us have. So I'm just hopeful that we're going to get to a better place in the world where instead of fear, people see hope. Instead of anger, we have love. And instead of exclusion, we have inclusion. This is my life's work. I'm very proud of what my agency does. It's one of the largest community action agencies in Oregon. We employ about 600 people. We're divided into 3 divisions. We run Head Start. We do a lot of early learning and child care work. We provide weatherization services for low-income homeowners. We provide energy assistance with help for people's light, gas, and water bills. But the biggest part of our work right now is this housing and homeless question, and it is very complex and very simple at the same time.
How do people get in touch?
So, we have a website, Mid-Willamette Valley Community Action Agency. You can access our services there. You can call us. You can talk to us there. Our phone numbers and web addresses and email addresses are there. What we're really hoping to do is build the next volunteer base in Salem for the coming generation. So we're going to need a lot of folks' help in the future.
Well, they can learn more at your website, and we'll have you back.
Love to. Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us on InSight today, and thank you for joining us. I'm Wendy Brokaw.